For decades, we were told a simple story, that the Vietnamese people come from a single, ancient root, that we've lived on this land, uninterrupted, unchanged, for thousands of years. A pure bloodline, an unbroken chain. But that story was never written in our DNA. Because when scientists finally looked past the surface, past the flags, the surnames, the school books, and deep into the genome itself, what they uncovered was a different history altogether. And it starts with a critical mistake. Most early studies of Vietnamese genetics relied on one group, the kin, the ethnic majority, convenient, accessible, and widespread. So researchers assumed the kin DNA must speak for the entire country. But in 2019, that illusion collapsed. A groundbreaking study sequenced over 22 ethno-linguistic groups across Vietnam, from the Eid in the Central Highlands to the Silla near the Laos border. And the results were nothing short of shocking. Instead of one unified ancestry, there were layers, clashes, ghosts, genetic footprints that defied expectation. In the genomes of Vietnamese people, scientists found traces of at least 5 major migration waves, from Hoabinian hunter-gatherers over 65,000 years ago, to rice farmers from Neolithic southern China, 4,000 years ago, to Austronesian seafarers arriving along the coast, to Taikadai tribes drifting in from the northwest, and even Han Chinese admixture during 1,000 years of imperial rule. Vietnamese DNA is not a single thread. It's a woven fabric, ancient, intricate, and far older than we were ever taught. And the most disturbing part? Some fragments of that DNA don't match any known population. Not in China, not in Southeast Asia, not in any genome on Earth. They called it the splinter in the code. So, if the stories we grew up with don't match the blueprint in our blood, what else have we forgotten? Because this isn't just about migration or identity. It's about the first people to ever walk this land. The ones who left no names, no records, only echoes in our cells. And to find them, we have to go back 70,000 years. Back to the very first footsteps in what we now call Vietnam. The ones who left no names, no records, only echoes in our cells. And to find them, we have to go back 70,000 years. That's when the first anatomically modern humans stepped into mainland Southeast Asia, long before pyramids, empires, or language families. A time when the region was covered in dense tropical forests, and survival meant silence, fire, and stone. They weren't farmers. They didn't build cities. But they left something far more permanent. They were the Hoabinian people, a population of ancient hunter-gatherers named after archaeological discoveries in the limestone caves of Hoa Binh Province, Vietnam. Their stone tools, rough-edged, flaked from river cobbles, mark a cultural tradition that lasted over 20,000 years. But for decades, scientists believe their story ended there, a cultural fossil with no living descendants. Until the DNA said otherwise. Recent ancient genome studies, particularly from man back 4,100 to 3,600 BP, and Nui Nap 2,100 to 1,900 BP, revealed that the Hoabinian legacy never disappeared. It was diluted, hidden, woven into the DNA of those who came after. Inside modern Austroasiatic speaking groups like the Mlabri, the Tin, and even segments of the kin, researchers found deeply divergent autosomal signals, ghost lineages that matched Andamanese Onge Islanders and Malaysian Jahai, both considered genetic relics of early Eastern Eurasian ancestry. One study showed that up to 30% of some early Neolithic individuals in northern Vietnam carried this Hoabinian-like ancestry, proof of admixture, not replacement. Their mtDNA and Y-DNA markers? Ancient, isolated, in some cases, completely unique to the region. They are Vietnam's oldest genetic foundation, not a single ethnic group, but a shadow beneath all the others. And their memory lives not in language or monuments, but in genes that survived everything. Fires, floods, dynasties, even the idea of Vietnam itself. But they didn't remain alone, because somewhere between 4,500 and 4,000 years ago, the land began to shift. Foreign farmers came from what is now southern China, bringing domesticated rice, bronze tools, and something far more enduring. They didn't just change the landscape. They rewrote the gene pool. They brought new blood and a new story. Around 4,500 years ago, the silence of the forest was broken, not by conquest, but by cultivation. From the river valleys of what is now southern China came the Neolithic farmers, carriers of rice, stone adzes, and something invisible, a new genetic wave. They followed fertile land southward, their language spoken in early Austroasiatic tongues, their movements slow but inevitable. And when they crossed into Vietnam, something irreversible happened. Buried deep in the ancient bones at the Man-Back site, dated between 4100 and 3600 BP, scientists found a fusion. DNA from this Neolithic population showed a startling mix, 70 to 75% East Asian farmer ancestry, paired with 25 to 30% Hoabinian hunter-gatherer blood. It wasn't replacement. It was collision. They didn't erase the first people. They absorbed them, married into them, planted rice on the lands of their ancestors, and raised children who carried both worlds in their veins. This wasn't just genetic. It was cultural combustion. Rice paddies replaced foraging trails. Settlements grew. Tools became finer, more standardized. By 1000 BCE, the region was producing bronze drums, symbols of power, fertility, ritual, ushering in what we now call the Dong Sun culture. This was Vietnam's first major civilization, but its roots were mixed from the beginning. So now a harder question rises. If the first Vietnamese were hunter-gatherers, and the farmers came from another land, who do we truly descend from? Do we claim the foragers who lived here first, or the farmers who brought the system that still feeds the nation today? And buried inside that question is a deeper conflict, because the next shift wasn't biological. It was linguistic. A new voice was rising, and sometimes the words didn't match the blood. Around 2,500 years ago, something strange began to happen. In the highlands of central Vietnam and along the southern coast, entire communities started speaking a different tongue. Not the Austroasiatic languages brought by Neolithic rice farmers, but something else. Austronesian, the same language family spoken across the Pacific, from Madagascar to Hawaii. But here's the twist. Their DNA didn't change. The people didn't come from the islands. Their genomes were still Austroasiatic. Their ancestry still rooted in the mainland. But their voices, their rituals, their entire cultural identity began to shift. This wasn't a migration. It was something rarer, stranger. It was cultural diffusion, the full adoption of a new language and identity, without any mass movement of people. Take the Cham people, for example. Their language is Austronesian, their architecture influenced by Hindu kingdoms, their legends linked to the sea. But genetically, they're still more closely related to other mainland Austroasiatic groups than to the islanders they sound like. How does that happen? Why would a people shed their mother tongue and speak with the voice of another civilization? Archaeological sites like Cham and Trakeo reveal clues. Burial grounds where the grave goods reflect Austronesian sea trade, but the skeletons carry mainland ancestry. In these tombs, language and blood sit side by side, but they're not always friends. And that raises a deeper question. If language, the thing that shapes how we think, pray, mourn, and dream, can travel separately from our genes, then what exactly is identity? Is it what's in our blood, or what we choose to remember? Because just as mainlanders were adopting oceanic voices, the ocean was sending more than just words. It was sending people, real ones, and with them came entire islands of ancestry. Off the coast of Vietnam, long before borders were drawn, a new people began to rise, not from the jungle, but from the sea. By the 2nd century CE, they called themselves Kampa. They built brick towers to Shiva, prayed in Sanskrit, sailed the Indian Ocean, but their DNA whispered a story no temple could tell. Because buried in the genomes of modern Cham descendants, scientists found a trace of something unexpected, a tile ancestry, an Austronesian-speaking group from the highlands of Taiwan. Roughly 10% of Cham genetic material links to these early seafarers, proof that the Austronesian expansion, which began over 5,500 years ago, had not only swept across the Pacific, it had touched the shores of Vietnam. And the waves didn't stop there. Further DNA studies revealed traces of South Asian lineages, introduced through trade with Indian kingdoms, merchants, monks, sailors, who came not with armies, but with spices, beliefs, and blood. In coastal populations of Champa, genetic markers even hint at Middle Eastern contact, likely Persian or Arab traders moving along maritime Silk Roads. It wasn't just a kingdom. It was a confluence, a human archive of East and West, India and Island, land and ocean, all encoded in the bones of Cham ancestors and still breathing in the bodies of Vietnamese today. It's why Cham art looks Indian. Why does their language sing like the Pacific? Why do their rituals echo across centuries in temples half swallowed by jungle? This wasn't diffusion. This was the arrival. And the coast became a mosaic, layer after layer, carried by tide and time. But not everyone joined the tide, because while the Cham sailed, built, and blended, there were others who stayed behind. In the mountains, in the mists, where bloodlines didn't shift, where genes stood still, and what lived there was untouched, frozen in time, waiting to be found. While coastal Vietnam became a crossroads of empires and oceans, the Highlands told a different story. No temples, no ships, no foreign names, just mountain mist, oral memory, and bloodlines that barely moved. Here, in the shadowed folds of the northern and central Highlands, live some of the most genetically isolated people in all of Southeast Asia. Take the Mang, a small ethnic group near the Laos border. When scientists sequenced their Y chromosomes, they were stunned. Nearly 97% carried the same paternal haplogroup, O1b, B426. That's not diversity. That's a genetic bottleneck. A founder event so intense, it froze an entire lineage in place, like pressing pause on history. Then there's the Sela, a group so small, their entire gene pool fits into a single statistical shadow. Low diversity, high drift, like a sealed cave where no outsiders ever stepped. But perhaps most fascinating are the Eid and Jirai, Austronesian-speaking groups of the Central Highlands. Their empty DNA, passed down from mother to child, tells a very different tale. Why? Because these are matrilocal societies. The men move, the women stay, and with them, the mother lines are preserved, ancient, unbroken, resistant to the genetic tides that shape the rest of the country. In their bones are empty DNA haplogroups like M71 and F1A subclades, rare even in surrounding regions, yet flourishing here, in communities where ancestry flows through the maternal line, like a sacred thread. These are not just ethnic groups. They are time capsules, frozen archives of Vietnam's oldest migrations, genetic libraries, untouched by war, empire, or even language shifts. And yet, not even the mountains could remain untouched forever, because while some held on to the past, others came with swords, scripts, and dynasties. And what came next wasn't just contact. It was a conquest, and the blood began to bend, because no mountain, no forest, no language could stop what was coming. In 111 BCE, after defeating the ancient kingdom of Nam Viet, the Han dynasty of China officially annexed the Red River Delta. It wasn't just a military campaign. It was cultural engineering, and it lasted for over 1,000 years. For successive Chinese dynasties ruled northern Vietnam, imposing Confucian law, Mandarin administration, and Han customs. But they also left something permanent: their DNA. Modern genomic studies, especially those analyzing autosomal SNPs and mitochondrial haplogroups in northern Vietnamese populations, reveal detectable Han Chinese admixture in the kin majority and neighboring minorities like the Thai and Nung. One of the strongest signals, haplogroup F1F, a maternal lineage that shows up in northern Vietnamese genomes and aligns with patterns of Chinese expansion southward. And it doesn't stop there. After Vietnamese independence was reclaimed in 938 CE, a new movement began, the Nam Tien, or Southward March. Over the next 7 centuries, ethnic Vietnamese expanded into territories once held by the Cham and Khmer. But this wasn't just territorial conquest. As the kin moved south, so did their genes. And those genes already carried multiple historical imprints: Hoabinian, Neolithic East Asian, Austroasiatic, and Han Chinese. So when kin populations began intermarrying with local groups in the Mekong and Central Highlands, they weren't bringing a single ancestry. They were bringing an empire's genetic echo. The irony: while Vietnamese resisted Chinese rule on the battlefield, Han DNA still flowed into the bloodline through generations of assimilation, marriage, and silent survival. This is the paradox. Vietnam's fiercest resistance heroes, like Trung Trac and Trung Nhi, who led a rebellion in 40 CE, fought against Han power. And yet today, their descendants may unknowingly carry traces of the very empire they defied. History leaves marks on monuments, but genetics leaves marks in silence. Marks you can't see until you sequence the code. But what if there's more? What if the most distinct Vietnamese genes aren't ancient at all? What if the final layer was hiding in plain sight? Until now. In 2025, Vietnam launched something unprecedented, a project so vast, it didn't just trace the past. It aimed to map the future. VN1K, a nation's genome, sequenced at scale. 1,011 individuals from 54 ethnic groups, across every province, from the Red River to the Mekong. Not just the Kin majority, but the Mang, Hmong, Bonner, Cham, and dozens more. For the first time, Vietnamese genetics weren't being compared to others. They were being seen on their own terms. And what the researchers found rewrote everything. Over 8.5 million novel genetic variants, never seen in other global reference databases. These weren't just random mutations. Some were functionally significant, critical, like HLA-B*15:02, a gene variant that can trigger severe reactions to common epilepsy drugs like carbamazepine, found at a higher-than-average rate in the Vietnamese population, or the CYP2D6*10 variant, carried by nearly 23% of those sampled. It slows the metabolism of painkillers and antidepressants. In Western dosing models, it can lead to underresponse or dangerous side effects. For decades, Vietnamese patients were treated based on global medical templates, but their bodies followed a different script. This wasn't just about ancestry anymore. This was pharmacogenomics, a new kind of medicine, written in Vietnamese DNA. And the breakthroughs didn't stop at the genetic code. For the first time, scientists mapped the entire Vietnamese methylome, the full epigenetic profile of how genes are switched on or off. It revealed stress markers, environmental signatures, and inherited patterns invisible to DNA alone. A silent archive, shaped by war, famine, colonization, and passed through generations without a word. The VN1K project didn't just recover lost history. It forced Vietnam to see itself at the molecular level. But with all this data, over 8 million variants, epigenomic maps, pharmacogenomic blueprints, one piece still doesn't fit. One signal refuses to match anything in the system. It's there, but has no name. And whatever it is, it's not just ancient, it's untraceable. When researchers completed sequencing the VN1K dataset, 1,011 individuals, 54 ethnic groups, they expected complexity. But not this. Within the genomic matrix, across multiple chromosomes, they began noticing haplotype blocks, long, inherited stretches of DNA, that didn't match any known global reference. Not the 1,000 Genomes Project, not the Human Genome Diversity Panel, not even ancient Eurasian genomes from Lake Baikal, Tianyuan Cave, or the Devil's Gate samples from Far Eastern Russia. This fragment, present in multiple individuals from northern Highland populations and even lowland Austroasiatic speakers, resisted classification. It wasn't Han Chinese. It wasn't an Austroasiatic farmer. It wasn't Cham Austronesian, Indian, or Papuan. Some scientists labeled it a ghost population signal, a term used when ancient ancestry is detected statistically, but the source population no longer exists or hasn't yet been sampled. This wasn't just a few alleles. In multiple samples, this fragment covered over 0.5% to 1% of total genomic ancestry, far beyond error margins. The fact it appears across unconnected groups suggests something even deeper, a pre-agricultural layer, older than 10,000 years, possibly tied to deeply divergent East Eurasian hunter-gatherers. Some geneticists now theorize this signal could originate from an unknown archaic human group, similar to how Denisovan DNA was first discovered, not from fossils, but from strange sequences in Melanesian genomes. Except here, in Vietnam, This ghost is even less understood. No ancient bone. No clear migration route. Only code, raw, silent, and unplaceable. A 2023 reanalysis published in Nature Communications even hinted that this lineage may have split from other East Asian ancestors over 45,000 years ago, before the Hoabinian toolmakers, before rice, before language. So what do we call it? A lost tribe? An unsampled human branch? A memory written in proteins? Or something more philosophical? Because if part of your genome cannot be explained by history, language, or empire, if it doesn't belong to science's current vocabulary, then maybe identity isn't just about what we remember. Maybe it's also about what we've forgotten, or what was never recorded. Because sometimes the most Vietnamese gene is the one we cannot name. And maybe it's not done telling its story. And maybe neither are we. Because after all the migration waves, all the unknown haplotypes, all the ghost signals left buried beneath jungle soil and empire scars, one truth remains. Vietnam was never a straight line. It was always a spiral. When scientists built the VN1K reference genome, the largest in Vietnamese history, they didn't find a master code. They found a mosaic. 1,011 people, 54 ethnic groups, 8.5 million unique genetic variants. Each variant, each haplogroup, each unbroken strand a whisper from another path. The Hoabinian foragers, who hunted with stone blades 65,000 years ago. Their legacy survives in mitochondrial haplogroups like M71 and R9b, still common in Austroasiatic-speaking Highlanders. The rice farmers from southern China, carriers of haplogroup O2A1, M95, whose DNA still pulses in the bones of lowland agriculturalists. The Cham seafarers, with their Austronesian roots and Etile echoes, tied to O1A, M119, and maritime expansion from Taiwan. The Han officials, who imposed rule but also left behind silent Y-chromosomal traces, like OTW1A1A6, integrated deeply into northern kin populations. Even minority groups like the Mang, Sila, and Pat Hen preserve genetic bottlenecks so pure they function as biological time capsules, untouched, unresolved, uncolonized. And yet, no single lineage stands alone. Because in the modern Vietnamese genome, there is no singular race, no original blood. What you find instead is resonance, shared immunity genes, overlapping epigenetic patterns, variants that alter how you metabolize medicine, not because of your skin or surname, but because of 1,000 unsung mothers and unrecorded migrations. You are not one culture. You are not one story. You are a braid of lost ancestors, each one adding to the weight of who you are. And if all this lives inside a single country, a single genome, then ask yourself, how many other ghost ancestries lie silent in your blood, waiting not to be rewritten, but finally to be heard?